Everyone is talking about creatine for the brain right now, and honestly, they're not wrong. But they're not entirely right either, because what the research actually shows is more specific and more interesting than what's blowing up on your feed. I went through the actual studies, properly controlled trials, pooled analyses across hundreds of participants, not the supplement company blogs, not the influencer hot takes. And what I found changes the question entirely. It's not, does creatine work for the brain? It's, does creatine work for your brain? Right now, given who you are and how you're living, that answer is different for almost everyone. And by the end of this, you'll know exactly where you fall. All the studies I reference are linked in the description. Go check them yourself. Let's start with what creatine actually is, because most people only know half the story. Your body makes creatine naturally, primarily in the liver and kidneys from amino acids. You also get it from food, mostly meat and fish. Once it's in your system, it travels to tissues that burn enormous amounts of energy, muscle, and brain. In those tissues, creatine does one critical job. It helps regenerate your cell's fuel molecule, the currency your body spends every time a muscle fires or a neuron activates. Creatine is the mechanism that restocks that currency fast. Now here's the thing about your brain. It's roughly 2% of your body weight. It burns 20% of your total energy. Every decision, every memory retrieval, every moment of sustained focus, neurons are burning through fuel at a ferocious rate. And when that energy supply falters, even slightly, cognitive performance drops. So the hypothesis that creatine could support brain function is not some fringe idea. It's grounded in basic neuroscience. The question is, does supplementing with extra creatine actually raise brain creatine levels enough to matter? And if it does that translate into measurable improvements in how you think? Those are two separate questions, and the answers are genuinely interesting. On the first question, yes, creatine supplementation does raise brain creatine levels. This has been confirmed using brain imaging technology that can measure chemical concentrations in living tissue without surgery. The effect is real, but modest. Your brain is much harder to saturate than your muscles because it has tighter control over what gets in. But the increase is measurable. On the second question, whether that translates into cognitive improvement, this is where it gets complicated. And this is where most of the content you're seeing online gets it wrong. Let's look at the best evidence we have. A 2024 systematic review, 16 properly controlled trials, nearly 500 participants, found that creatine supplementation produced meaningful improvements in memory and attention speed. The effect was real, statistically significant, and consistent across the studies included. A separate analysis, focusing specifically on memory, found the same signal. And it found something else, something that fundamentally changes how you should think about this supplement. The cognitive benefits were nearly 3 times larger in older adults, people in their late 60s and 70s, compared to younger participants. In younger adults, the effect was so small it was essentially zero. In older adults, it was one of the larger effects you'll see from any safe, over-the-counter supplement. That is not a minor footnote. That is the whole story. Now, I want to be transparent about something here, because this is exactly the kind of detail most health channels don't bother to mention. That memory analysis was later challenged by other researchers who identified a statistical error in the original paper. a problem called double counting, where multiple test results from the same participants were treated as independent data points. That inflated the apparent effect size. When the authors corrected their own analysis, and to their credit, they did, the overall memory effect dropped to non-significant. The headline finding didn't hold up across all ages. But, and this is critical, the older adults subgroup survived the correction. Even with the tighter, more rigorous math, the benefit in people aged 66 to 76 remained meaningful and statistically robust. So the science is messier than the headlines suggest. That's usually true. But the core conclusion, that creatine helps aging brains more than young ones, held up even under scrutiny. That's actually a stronger signal, not a weaker one. But there's more. A 2024 study examined what happens to cognition during sleep deprivation and found something remarkable. A single high dose of creatine partially reversed the cognitive drop that comes from being awake for 21 hours straight. Processing speed, reaction time. Creatine blunted the decline significantly. And the same pattern shows up in research on vegetarians and vegans. Because creatine is found almost exclusively in animal products, people who don't eat meat have systematically lower creatine stores across both muscle and brain. When they supplement, they show stronger cognitive responses than omnivores. Their baseline is lower. The room for improvement is larger. There's also emerging work connecting creatine to mood and depression, specifically in populations where brain energy metabolism is compromised. Early findings suggest creatine may help stabilize brain energy in ways that matter for mental health, not just cognitive speed. This is preliminary. I'll come back to this in a future dispatch. But it's worth flagging because it hints at a much broader role than anyone was talking about 5 years ago. Now, the counterpoint. Because Marcus doesn't cherry-pick. The largest single trial done to date, 123 participants, double-blind, crossover design, published in a high-quality journal, found that 5 grams per day for 6 weeks produced effects that barely reached significance for memory tasks and no meaningful effect on reasoning or fluid intelligence. In a well-nourished, relatively young population. And a rigorous 2024 systematic review concluded that the theoretical case for creatine improving cognition hasn't been consistently proven by the evidence available. So, how do we hold both things at once? The answer is this, and this is the frame that makes everything else make sense. Creatine works cognitively when your brain creatine stores are low, and your stores are low under specific conditions, when you're older and your natural synthesis is declining, when you're sleep-deprived, burning through energy faster than you're restoring it, when you're under sustained cognitive or physical stress, when you eat little or no animal protein. And research suggests women may also have lower baseline creatine levels than men, which means the upside from supplementation could be larger across the board. If none of those conditions apply to you, if you're 28, well-rested, eating meat regularly, not under unusual stress, your brain creatine tank is probably already close to full. Adding more doesn't overflow the tank in a useful way. The effect is essentially zero. This is not how most supplements work. Most supplements either work or they don't. Creatine for the brain is different. It works in proportion to your deficit, which means the people who need it most get the most out of it, and the people who need it least get almost nothing. Here's where I land. The people selling creatine as a universal brain supplement, a nootropic for everyone, are overselling it. The evidence simply doesn't support that claim in young, healthy, well-nourished people. The largest, best-designed trials in those populations show weak to negligible cognitive effects. But the people dismissing the brain angle entirely are also missing something real. For specific populations, and those populations are larger than you might think, creatine is one of the most evidence-backed, safest, and cheapest cognitive interventions available. Not a dramatic upgrade, a meaningful, consistent, well-replicated improvement in memory and processing speed in the people who have the most to gain. Here's the reframe I'd give you. Stop thinking of creatine as a nootropic. Start thinking of it as a deficit corrector. It restores something that's been depleted, and whether you're depleted depends entirely on your age, your diet, your sleep, and your stress load. So, what do you actually do with this? If you're over 50, creatine monohydrate, 5 grams per day, with food. Morning is fine. No loading phase necessary. This is one of the simplest, cheapest, best evidenced things you can do for your brain as you age. The muscle benefits are a bonus. If you eat mostly plant-based, same protocol, your baseline is low. The cognitive research on vegetarians is consistent. This is a clear gap worth filling. If you're younger, eating meat, sleeping reasonably well, the cognitive case is weak. Take it if you want the muscle benefits. But don't expect a brain upgrade. The data doesn't support that expectation. And if you're anyone who regularly runs on poor sleep, there's a specific case for higher doses on your worst days. That research is early, but it's pointing somewhere interesting. What I'm watching next, there's a growing body of work on creatine's role in depression and mood disorders, specifically tied to brain energy metabolism. And separately, research on the muscle-brain connection, the idea that creatine's cognitive benefits in aging may be partly driven through muscle health, not just direct brain effects. That connection is more profound than it sounds. I'll be covering both. If this changed how you think about creatine, send it to one person who's been buying the wrong supplements for the wrong reasons. And I'll see you in the next dispatch.